Hello to everybody joining me. I'm Erin, and welcome to the Virtual Education Intervention Podcast. The name should give it away, but I'm here to educate, encourage, and entertain families and teachers who live and work with neurodivergent individuals. And yep, you guessed it, my primary location for education is virtual. Sometimes we all just need a little more community, and we benefit from having people in our lives who understand how we live, how we work, and what our minds are consumed with daily. We need support and encouragement within that space. If you're here, welcome to our community. I am so glad you're joining us for this episode today. Our last episode took a little bit of a detour from the series on executive dysfunction that we've been doing, and while it's still focused on executive function skills, we kind of looked at executive function life hacks, the unhinged, so to speak, strategies that families use at home. We kind of did a live reaction to that social media boom of unhinged hacks. We had a lot of fun reading through some posts and comments, and there were quite a few really smart strategies that families employ to support their ADHD or neurodivergent kids. Now, this episode is going to circle back to our series on executive function skills. If you haven't listened to our previous episodes yet, I would highly recommend you do so. So far, we've focused on organization or planning an organization, working memory, and one of our most popular episodes, emotional regulation. Today, we're going to focus on the executive function skill of impulse control. This is a huge topic of conversation in the neurodivergent community, specifically for individuals with ADHD. We're going to take a look at what is impulse control, why it's difficult for some kids, and let's be honest, some adults, and how to support it. Now, we're focused today on speaking to parents, teachers, tutors, family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles. If you have an individual, a neurodivergent individual in your life, maybe they have ADHD, maybe they have autism, maybe they have a learning disability, or maybe executive function skills just are a little bit slower to develop. I'm talking to you today. We're going to talk about strategies. You're going to leave this podcast with strategies to use today and also a plan for the long game. It's important to recognize that with executive function, especially impulse control, you're really playing the long game. We're not looking to fix, so to speak, our children. We're not looking to fix ourselves if we happen to be neurodivergent, but we are looking to continue to support our kids, support our students, and continue to grow with the strategies and the skills that are going to help us now and in the future. So while we're playing the long game here, that doesn't mean that we don't have strategies that we can kind of pull out of our back pocket to use in the moment. But I just wanted to preface this with this is one of those skills that does kind of take that long approach. And you're going to see tiny little baby steps along the way. And we need to celebrate the baby steps because in the long run, they're going to add up to massive growth. Let's start our podcast today with the question, what is impulse control? Impulse control is the ability to pause before you react. Stop before you speak. Pause before you act or react. There's the common phrase that parents will say. I don't know if you heard it growing up, but I did, my siblings did. But it's this idea of thinking before you speak. You need to stop and think before you speak. And that just means give your brain that time to process and decide what it wants to say before you blurt out the first thing that comes to mind or the first thing that pops out of your mouth. Or even in some cases, think before you move, right? Many individuals with neurodiversity are just very quick to physically move. So it's this idea of stopping and thinking before you act in any way. Now, as kids, it's like we just mentioned, this physical action or blurting out an answer. But as we get older into teenage years and into adulthood, this can be really impactful because when we're adults, and remember, education is preparing kids for adults. As parents, we are preparing our children for adulthood. We want our kids to be productive members of society. So we need them to master their impulse control while they're with us so that it doesn't become an adult-sized issue later on. So it doesn't impact their finances. It doesn't impact their credit. It doesn't impact their ability to do certain things, right? We want to make sure that our kids have all opportunity in the world. So we don't want them to have impulse control issues as adults that could have long-lasting effects. So we teach it now and we practice it now, and we have consistent repetition over a long period of time while our kids are with us, so that by the time they get to adulthood, they have a lot more impulse control. Now, impulse control also ties back to self-regulation. This is managed, again, with the executive function skills, managed by the prefrontal cortex in the brain. Now, if you kind of picture where your forehead is, that's the part of the brain that's directly behind your forehead. Fascinatingly, this part of the brain does not fully develop in anybody until the mid-20s. We make a lot of decisions that could impact our life before we get to be mid-20s. Now, if it doesn't fully develop for a typically developing or a neurotypical individual, if it doesn't develop for them until the mid-20s, think about the impact that self-regulation, that impulse control, that development of that prefrontal cortex can have on our neurodivergent individuals. I've shared this statistic before, but recent studies have shown that executive function skills, those skills, the CEO of the brain, operated by that prefrontal cortex, they're oftentimes up to 30% behind their same age peers. So neurodivergent individuals, if a student or a child has ADHD, autism, a learning disability, if they have any kind of impact on their executive function skills, the development of those skills could be up to 30% delayed compared to their same aged peers. So your 10-year-old with ADHD may have the impulse control of a 7-year-old. The 21-year-old with autism or a learning disability or ADHD might have the executive function skills or the emotional regulation or the organizational skills, the impulse control of a 14-year-old. And that's what kind of gives me the red flags a little bit. I don't want to say it worries me, but that's a huge gap. The older we get, the larger that gap gets and the larger that gap feels. There's a massive difference between the abilities of a 14-year-old and the abilities of a 21-year-old, even into adulthood, into legality. There can be a lot of implications when a 21-year-old makes decisions like a 14-year-old would. Those planning and organization, impulse control, especially. So that's why I really want to emphasize the importance of developing these skills with intention. Let's close that gap so that maybe if we were at 30%, now it can be at 25, now it can be at 20. Let's catch our individuals with neurodivergence up so that that 30% gap lessens and they are better able to manage their own executive function, better able to control those impulses. Now, this skill development is about delayed gratification and the ability to resist immediate urges in favor of those long-term goals. That's kind of the big main idea of impulse control. Now, that's challenging for a lot of people, whether you have neurodivergence or not. Our culture, our society, social media, television, the internet, everything in our world right now focuses on that instant gratification. I see it, I want it, I have to have it. That's cute. Where did you get it? Amazon. I'm going to prime it. It's going to be at my house in 2 days. We do that all the time. Now, it's difficult for many of us, whether we have ADHD or neurodivergence or not, to accept that delayed gratification within the world that we live. Now, on top of that, add ADHD, add autism with the hyper-focus and interest. I see it, I have to have it. And any form of executive dysfunction, and that impulse control is further impacted. So our goal is to teach ourselves, to teach our students, to teach our children about that delayed gratification. The ability to resist the immediate urge to do something, to purchase something, to want to say something in favor of a better long-term goal or alternative. Now, here's one note that I want to emphasize before we move forward in the podcast. Children who struggle, adults who struggle, teenagers who struggle with impulse control are not choosing bad behavior. They're not choosing to misbehave. They aren't being bad. What they have is a gap in the skill. So it's not about bad behavior. It's more like a skill deficit. So I want to emphasize that because it can be hard, it can be difficult, it can be frustrating when you have a child or you're working with a student that has impulse control challenges. They just blurt something out or they just act without thought to the consequences. We need to make sure that our approach, our response, certainly we need to correct any misbehavior, but our approach needs to be from the perspective of a skills gap, not a moral failing, not a choice of bad behavior, but rather we need to approach it from an opportunity to help our students learn and to help them grow those skills. Now we're going to continue and dive into how impulse control shows up. So we're going to look at the different age ranges, take a look at what is age appropriate and what we sometimes see in our neurodivergent individuals and kind of compare that. So in toddlers and preschoolers, our young kiddos, you might typically see or developmentally see grabbing, hitting, running away. That is developmentally normal for that age range. Some kids don't outgrow that on what we would consider the typical schedule. We understand that every child is different. Kids develop differently. That's a thing. However, there are some behaviors that you would expect to see grow, change, mature over time. And so when you're talking about toddlerhood and preschoolers, you're wanting to see that grabbing, hitting, running away type of behavior mature. Because those are those impulses, right? Oh, I'm going to grab the toy that I want. Oh, you made me mad. I'm going to hit you. Oh, I don't like what you're saying. I'm going to run away. So as we continually grow and develop, we can better control those impulses. But if that impulse control is not developing at the rate that we think it should, we're going to continue to see some of these behaviors in toddlers and preschoolers. We're going to see that carry on into school and into school-aged kids. Now, when our kids start to be school-aged, elementary, kindergarten, elementary, and up, and we're really looking at what we would expect in a classroom setting or at that age in some kind of educational setting. Things like blurting out an answer in class, cutting in line, grabbing things from a classmate, quitting a game when they lose. Those things are developmentally normal early on, but the more that a student is in a particular model of education, the less those impulse responses should happen. And when I say model of education, I'm recognizing that there are some kids that are going to be in a general education classroom setting in a public school. There are going to be some kids that are in a special education class, some kids that attend private schools, some children that are homeschooled or in some kind of cohort or co-op. So I don't want to only speak to, the public school setting. We want to look at the wide variety of education models and how that can impact our children with neurodivergence. So when I look at the impulse control challenges in students that attend different programs, I'm looking at the expectation placed on them in each program. You might have an ADHD third grader who's in a general education class who is blurting out those answers, and you're seeing that impulse control challenge. They're just blurting it out. They're blurting it out. That's not appropriate in that setting, and we're seeing that as a challenge. However, you may have another third grader with ADHD in maybe a Montessori school or a project-based program, and they're up and they're moving, and the expectation is not that they raise their hand. The expectation is that they simply ask a question. But maybe they have other strict rules and expectations that we can see demonstrating executive dysfunction or impulse control issues. So I want to recognize that we're going to see different things based on the expectation that we have in our kids in different settings. Now, then that's true regardless of the age. It's just kids are going to kind of mold and develop within the environment that they're placed or that they are living or being educated. So if you have a homeschool student, I have 4 kids at home. Right now I'm homeschooling 3 of them. Next year it'll be all 4. My kids kind of just blurt things out. They ask questions, they interrupt, and most of the time I'm fine with that because it's just managing 4 kids and they're curious and that's our learning environment. But there are times where we have to say, we're going to let mom teach. You hold your questions and ask me in a little bit, right? We're still teaching those skills. However, in that same environment, if I see my kids quitting really quickly when they get frustrated or getting up and moving around and not being able to sit still, I have other indicators in that setting of impulse control. So you really want to look at what the expectation of the child is in this setting that they're in and compare that to the impulse control issues you're seeing to be able to identify whether it's age appropriate or if it's above and beyond that, if it's more concerning or maybe it points to more impulse control issues. Now, diving into kind of the teenage years, some impulse control things we're going to see there would be speaking out inappropriately, testing boundaries, trying new language that maybe they heard from their friends, interrupting the parent or the teacher. Now, this is also when it can get to unsafe risk-taking. Things like quitting a job or an assignment midway. You're going to start to see the impact that impulse control issues can have in a very real way when students start to become teenagers, when they start to get jobs. So not that you haven't seen it in a real way before, but I think that the teenager is going to start seeing the impact more so. Once children start to get into that middle school, high school age range, there's less constant oversight, at least in most school settings, and there's more of an expectation that these students are independent in managing themselves. So managing and planning and organizing their homework, keeping all of their stuff organized, participating in events, handing in homework, being on time. So the level of expectation in independence increases the older that our students get. So what we see sometimes here is when students struggle. Maybe they struggle with an assignment, maybe they struggle with an academic concept, maybe socially, maybe in a new job. Oftentimes, they lack that forethought, right? That delayed gratification, and they want the frustration to be over, and they want it to be over now. So instead of problem solving, talking to the teacher, talking to the boss, figuring out a better approach, they will quit. And it's not because they just aren't willing to work. It's that immediate, I need relief. I need that dopamine boost. something happy. I need to be done with this. I have to put it aside. I don't like this. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. So we need to continue to work with our students at this point, and maybe we need to be more proactive and not expect that they're going to come to us. We need to just insert ourselves and be proactive here. We need to help our students understand that there are real implications to some of these decisions. Quitting a job because you didn't like it, or you were bored, or it wasn't within your hyper-focus area is going to mean that you're not going to have a reference for the next job. It's gonna look bad that you quit a job right away, and your next boss might not hire you, or the next place you apply might not hire you right away. You might not get a good grade because you turned in an assignment that was poorly completed or not completed because you quit midway. So this is when those consequences, more like the natural consequences, I like to call them, can be impacting our students at this point. This is also when we can have real life consequences, unsafe risk-taking if you have students that become sexually active at this point. And so it's really important that our students are aware of the risks that they're taking, and that the parents are speaking with the children. And I place this responsibility on parents. There can be a debate another time about the school's responsibility for educating students on sexual education. But oftentimes you see unsafe risk-taking, and that can really impact social lives, that can impact other health-related things. And so I'm pointing that out because I want to really emphasize the importance of supporting our students in their teenage years with these impulse control and executive function challenges. Now, I want to also point out, regardless of the age range, that the behavior that we see, or the impulse control responses that we're seeing, often show up more when our kids are tired, when they're overstimulated, or when they're anxious. So, I mean, it's true for me. I'm assuming it's true for you if you're listening to this, that when you're tired, you have a harder time controlling your responses to things. And the same is true for our children and our students. So it's something to recognize that when our kids are tired, when they're nervous about something, when they're overwhelmed or overstimulated, it can breed instead of frustration in us that they're struggling or we have to deal with their struggle, it needs to breed compassion in us. That I understand you're tired, and that makes it extra hard for you to control your response. I like to say, and sometimes I'll tell my kids this when I am maybe a smidge cranky. I know that should never happen. It never happens to you, but it happens to me. So hopefully you can relate. I will say to my kids, I'm sorry, mommy's having big feelings right now. And because I'm tired, it's hard for me to control my big feelings. And I use that language, we've talked in other podcasts about modeling for our kids. I want my kids to understand that, mom's not perfect, just like they're not perfect, and mom's trying her best, just like I know they're trying their best, but also I'm recognizing that I have these big feelings, and sometimes big feelings are hard, especially when I'm tired, so that when my kids are struggling, I can look at them and say, are you having big feelings? Not to put words in their mouth, but I want them to recognize that they can express that. It gives them words to how they're feeling. And we can kind of have that conversation as a starting point. All right, so diving into specific neurodivergence, we've talked about ADHD, we've talked about autism, we've talked about learning disabilities. So I want to kind of take that one at a time, because impulse control issues can look different in different individuals because we're all different people, but also in different forms of neurodivergence, in different disabilities. So when you're talking about ADHD, impulse control is often considered a core challenge. Now, this is more prevalent in boys than girls. That hyperactive component is more prevalent in boys than girls. But impulse control, even when you have a female student or female adult with ADHD, impulse control can be a real challenge. Females just tend to internalize it more. Oftentimes, women aren't diagnosed with ADHD until they're adults because the physical hyperactivity is not present. Rather, it presents as a very people-pleasing, perfection, anxiousness, and this internal constant worry. Your brain is just like a hamster wheel that never stops. And that is part of that impulse control. We can't control the impulse to overthink, to worry, to process that information and kind of think 5 steps ahead but miss the details. So many of us, many individuals with neurodivergence, we act before we think, we blurt out, we interrupt, we struggle with that emotional impulsivity. That is directly related to ADHD. The impulse control is a core challenge in many individuals with ADHD. And so when you think of impulse control, a lot of times we think of a particular person or this characteristic in ADHD. So it's just that very quick response, blurting out, very quick interruption. It can even be a struggle with emotional impulsivity. So I want to connect this impulsivity with emotional regulation. So especially if our kids are tired, but if your student struggles with emotional regulation, it can really also tie in with impulse control. And if you kind of put those two together in a blender, it can be a challenging experience for our students with ADHD. Now, if we kind of dissect autism a little bit, or the autism spectrum disorder, impulsivity can often be accompanied with that rigid thinking and that sensory overload that can look like impulsivity. So, for example, in the past, I've had a student, we've worked on reading comprehension, and he had autism, kind of that, what you would expect, that classic autism. And he just absolutely loved a certain topic. And so our goal was to kind of expand what he would read and expand his understanding, his ability to sequence a story and to dive into more inferences and some more abstract concepts within what he was reading. And so this rigid thinking and kind of the unwillingness to try what he didn't think he liked presented like a very impulsive response. So I had recommended at one point reading a specific book. And his immediate response, just like that, was, nope, I don't like that book. I didn't like it the first time that I read it. I'm not reading that book. And so in kind of being on the receiving end of that, it was a very quick response in a very almost impulsive way that he reacted. He just kind of had to get it out, and he wasn't going to stop, and he wasn't going to think, and he wasn't going to give it any kind of consideration because he already knew that he did not like that book. So if you kind of connect that rigid thinking with that immediate response, it can often look a lot like impulsivity. In addition, that students with autism or ASD, if they have an impulsive response, it can be impacted with physical space. So they might run, they might bolt, they might kind of need to get out of the space that they're in, and they need to escape from that. Could be related to that rigid thinking. It could be related to sensory overwhelm, but they might bolt or they might start stimming. So if you've ever seen an individual stim, they do different things. They might flap their hands, they might rub something together, they might move their foot a certain way. They might do any kind of physical motion repetitively, and it kind of calms their internal body, so to speak. But those can be related to that impulsivity, or it can appear that way because of that rigid thinking and that sensory overwhelm. All of those things together look like a very quick response. Learning disabilities can also impact executive function. Now, sometimes this, gets a few more skeptics because it's not necessarily ADHD. ADHD is basically executive dysfunction. But when you look at how you approach working with an individual with a learning disability, the intervention is very much steeped in executive function. So it's reasonable to expect that an individual with a learning disability may also display impulsive behaviors or challenges with executive function skills. One of the things that can trigger impulsivity in a student with a learning disability is frustration. And that is not uncommon in individuals with learning disabilities. Sometimes it feels like there's a black hole in their brain and the information, if it might make sense in that moment when it's on their working memory and you're doing it together, and then it just goes into that black hole of the brain, never to return again. But the challenge is, the expectation is from teachers, from parents, from tutors, from people working with them, that the expectation is that that information does return. And an individual with a learning disability may not know how to pull that back out of the black hole. So they have to learn it again, and they have to learn it again, and they have to learn it again. And gradually over time and with repetition, it doesn't go quite so deep into that black hole, or at least not as much of it. And they learn it and they practice it, and they can recall more information. They can recall it quickly because we know that the brain develops neurons, and neurons connect and grow and strengthen. And the more a neuron grows and connects and strengthens, the faster we can pull information and the faster the information flows in our brain. So we know that we can develop these neurons, but the outcome of the information going into the black hole, at least at first, is frustration. Because as much as these students are trying, they're not able to retain the content when their peers are. So not only are they not able to retain the content that they've spent so much time learning, but they look around the room and they see peers who it seems like are effortlessly learning. That's a very frustrating experience, and it's one that we need to be aware of. So impulse behaviors in regards to frustration, in regards to learning disabilities, can look like ripping up their paper, quitting when they get frustrated, maybe acting out of frustration. It's oftentimes an emotional reaction, right? Frustration is that emotion, and it's kind of bubbling to the surface and kind of exploding. It can often be a reaction to cognitive fatigue. So if you think about it that way, they're trying, it's just not coming, and they're frustrated and they're tired, and that breeds this emotional overload. And so that's when we see a lot of that impulsivity in students with learning disabilities. It's more related to the emotional response and frustration of their academic challenges. And so I want to just take a moment again to reiterate, none of these are character flaws, whether you're working with or have a child with ADHD or autism or a learning disability. Our kids are not making bad choices. They're not acting out because they want to act out. These are not character flaws. They are brain-based differences. It is a deficit in the skill set, and that skill set is what we need to continue to practice. So let's segue now into these practical strategies for supporting impulse control. I mentioned before, and I'm going to reiterate this suggestion, is this idea of modeling and co-regulation. Again, this is a long game play here. You need to narrate your own impulse control verbally. In a moment of frustration or a moment after the fact, in a moment of calm after the chaos, so to speak, you're going to verbalize, I really wanted to yell, but I'm going to take a breath first. Maybe, I really wanted to get upset, but I'm going to take a break and give myself a timeout first. However you regulate yourself in the moment of frustration, you need to verbalize that for your children so that they have that external voice telling them. Your kids are lacking the internal voice. So when we lack the skills, it means they lack the voice that tells them that they need to take a break first. In my head, I can tell myself, oh, you need to calm down, you need to take a break, you need to take a deep breath, don't respond that way. I have that internal voice. My kiddos with ADHD, maybe they don't have that internal voice. They need to hear it externally. They need you to be that voice for them because they don't have it inside their head like you probably do. This also helps them regulate. So if you can stay calm, if you can verbalize your own impulse control, and if you can regulate all of that, that's going to help them. I like to call this the calm anchor idea. You're kind of being that firm foundation, the anchor of peace in the midst of chaos. My kids love Inside Out 2, and if you haven't seen it, there's a character in there of anxiety. It's this visual representation inside of our brain of what anxiety looks like, and this character is bright orange and has like little hair that goes all over. And it just is a perfect representation of what anxiety looks like in our brain. And I reference that. You should Google it if you haven't seen the movie or watch it. It's great. But I mention that because we don't want to feed into our kids' anxiety. When they're upset, whether it's anger, frustration, anxiety, whatever it is, we don't want to engage with that. We want to be the calm to our kids' chaos. We don't want to add to the chaos. So being that calm anchor and allowing our kids to come into our calm in the moment rather than adding to the chaos is really important. So if we can stay calm, I know this is difficult. Parents, I understand. Teachers, I get it. It can be difficult to remain level-headed, to remain calm, to not let your blood pressure get up, to not respond quickly when there's a chaotic moment. But if we can intentionally remain low-key, that calm anchor in those moments, it's going to help our kids regulate themselves, come into our calm. One thing that I really like to use here with my kids when they're upset, they're having an emotional dysregulation moment, whatever it is, I like to keep my voice really low key, almost monotone, and I say, when your voice matches mine, that's when we're going to talk about what's going on, or that's when I'll have this conversation with you. Because my kids will often want to talk about whatever it is in that moment of frustration. And they're not going to like what I have to say. They're not going to like the answer I'm going to give them. And it's just going to continue to perpetuate that frustration or that emotional dysregulation. So I'm modeling in this moment, when your voice matches mine, that is when we're going to talk about it. I'm recognizing that we are going to have a conversation about what they want to talk about. But I'm also giving them the expectation that they need to bring their voice down. They need to calm themselves down. Here's a physical or a verbal example of how you can do it in the level that I want you to be at. And oftentimes, my kids will start to regulate themselves. Sometimes they need a hug. Sometimes they need a little boost there. But once they start to regulate themselves, oftentimes it'll be, my voice matches yours, because they still kind of have the shaky tears inside of them, but they're trying. And I say, great job. Take a deep breath. You're almost there. Try it again. When your voice matches mine. And so it's kind of this calming coaching session to get them regulated. Now, that can apply to emotional dysregulation, that can apply to impulse control, that can apply to a variety of executive function skills, but that calm anchor is so important. Now, the other thing that we can do to be a little more proactive with impulse control, especially if you have a classroom or in your home, if you have a certain place that you can put visuals of expected and unexpected behaviors, something that can really help ahead of time is having students know the expectations in advance. Because if they don't know the expectation and they get in trouble, that's not really fair. That's frustration. That's kind of like breeding ground for impulsive responses. But if they know what's expected of them versus what is unexpected, and it's outlined, it's gone over, there's a visual representation of that, that can be really, really helpful. The other proactive approach is to role play scenarios or create short social stories. So this is the type of thing that, again, it's the long game. When we are upset or having a moment of impulsivity, we're not always thinking, oh, I remember acting that out with my teacher, or I remember practicing that with my mom. That's not immediately going to come to mind. But if we can practice consistently and over time, then we're building those neural pathways so that gradually and eventually becomes the response we're going to have. We don't have to think back intentionally, oh, I remember when I role played that, but rather it's just going to be that ingrained response. And so role playing these scenarios, creating these short stories can be really helpful over time for building that repetition within this skill set. Now, I really like replacement strategies as well. So we're being proactive with those proactive strategies, but in the moment, we need something to replace the impulsivity. So we can do something called offer an alternative. Oh, instead of grabbing that toy, you can ask for a turn. Okay, instead of this, you can do this. What I like about that is you're stopping that impulsivity. You are correcting behavior when and where it needs to be corrected, but you're giving your student or your child an alternative. You're not completely shutting them down. I don't know about you, but I do not like to be ignored or shut down. I like to be heard. Whether you like what I'm saying or not, I don't care, but as long as you give me an ear for a moment and you hear what I have to say, that's really important to me. So giving our students that positive alternative and option so that they are still heard is really important. Instead of this, try that. Here's what you can do. Now, we also really want to praise the effort, not just the outcome. So sometimes with that impulsivity, the ultimate outcome isn't what we were hoping for, but we still saw growth. Wow, you waited, and I saw that you waited. That was really hard, and you did it. That's amazing. Now, the child might still have, in the end, done the impulsive thing. But like we said before, the impulse, when we have impulse control issues, it's like that switch is flipped off and they have no stopgap, no pause before doing the thing. So if you're starting to recognize a pause, that's really important, and that's something to be praised because we have that positive praise, and our kids, we know our kids love positive praise. They want more of it. So now they're just slowly a little bit more aware each time. Oh, Mom liked what I did. That was a good thing. That was a good feeling to get praised for that. I'm going to really keep trying. A few other things, a few environmental supports and some fun activities we can do to build that impulse control are going to be what we wrap up the podcast with. But I want to mention these environmental supports. I think they're really important for our impulse control. We want to reduce specific triggers for our kids. So if you have a student with autism or somebody who's more sensory sensitive, we want to make sure they're not overloaded with a sensory overload or a lack of structure. So first we have to make sure that the environment in which they're learning is tailored to meet their needs. If we have this overload or we're lacking structure, it's really easy to get dysregulated, and then our impulse control just explodes from there, or our lack of impulse control, I should say. Things like timers, space to calm down, or sensory spaces can be helpful. Movement breaks can also be incredibly helpful, especially for impulsivity. Now, there's some fun ways we can build impulse control. Again, like I said earlier in the beginning of this podcast, there are some things we can do kind of in the moment to practice these skills. While we work really hard for the long game, that repetition and that practice, we want to see that growth over time. We also can practice these skills immediately. Now, I love these games because kids don't even know that they're working on impulse control. Red light, green light is a super fun game that every kid loves to play. You don't have to differentiate your neurodivergent kids from your neurotypical kids. Everybody's going to play this game. Everybody's going to practice this skill, but it does target that impulse control. The same thing goes with freeze dance, Simon Says, board games that have turn taking and rule following, anything like Uno or Guess Who. And then lessons that require specific step development, things like karate or swimming. Now, when I spoke to my kid's pediatrician a while back about my concerns about my daughter's development, I was concerned about ADHD at the time, he said, have her try something like karate. Because just by the nature of what it is, it's highly effective in teaching impulse control, emotional regulation, executive function skills like that. And so I did a little more research on that. That really piqued my curiosity because I loved that it was this physical activity that kids can do that support ADHD. And it wasn't, medication. And I'm not opposed to medication where it's needed, but it wasn't like a medical intervention, but rather it was a physical activity. So something like karate. My kids are in swim lessons and they have to master a skill before they really continue to develop. So that skill mastery is really important. So I love this idea of just finding things that kids are interested in and pouring into that, or even if they're not interested in, but maybe they're a little bit curious about. Maybe it's something that you want them to learn. For us in our household, it's swimming. We want our kids to make sure that they're safe in the pool. So we'll always say, look, it's okay if you don't love swimming in the long run, but you have to know how to do it to be safe in the water. So that's really a priority for our family. And that might look different for your family. But lessons or coaching that require specific step development and mastery can be really helpful in building that impulse control. High interest activities that practice the skill, not just correct the behavior. So we're going to wrap up the podcast today now with some encouragement and some final takeaways. Impulse control, it's a long game skill. We've mentioned it multiple times. We want to expect progress in months and years, not in days or hours or minutes. We're going to see baby steps along the way, and we are going to celebrate the garbage out of those baby steps. But they might be slow baby steps, and then you'll see kind of like what feels like this big, massive growth spurt in this area, so to speak. And not that it's not, but it's really kind of this result of all of those baby steps put together and your kids demonstrating it all at once. And your mind is kind of blown. You're like, holy cow. Why did I ever doubt that you would make this progress? Because it's so great. So we're going to celebrate those baby steps. We're going to let kids borrow our calm, be that calm anchor until our kids can find their own sense of peace and calm and regulation. I want to also encourage you, if you have a child who struggles, if you're a teacher and you have a student who struggles, you are not failing if your child struggles. They are still learning, and they're learning likely from a deficit in a skill set. So give yourself as a parent, as an educator, grace. Give your kiddos and your students a little bit of grace as we continue to work with intention on these skills. And as a reminder, it's a skill, not a choice, and it is absolutely worth the time to nurture it. We're going to try one small step today. That's my challenge to you. Pick one thing. Maybe it's a visual cue, maybe putting a poster of expected and unexpected behaviors. Maybe it's practicing a script with your kid or trying a moment of co-regulation. Pick one, maybe it's an activity, maybe it's a board game or signing up for karate lessons. But pick one small next step and move forward in that direction to support your kids. The rest will come, more strategies will come, and you can embed more things and try new things as they come. But starting with one small step and moving forward is the best way to begin supporting your kids with impulse control. Now, next week, we're going to dive into another executive function skill. I'm going to leave that one a mystery. You'll have to tune into the next podcast to hear about that. But as a reminder to you as well, Aaron Luchter Hand Coaching is a mission and vision-driven small business designed to support you. As a team, we provide virtual intervention and education to break down barriers and create access to research-based tools that empower neurodivergent individuals. By addressing challenges specific to neurodiversity, our sessions foster growth, resilience, and self-confidence, equipping students and adults with the skills they need to thrive. We envision a world where neurodivergent individuals are empowered to embrace their unique strengths, knowing they are created on and for a purpose. Through innovative virtual interventions, we strive to build a future where every learner feels valued, capable, and confident, all while fostering a shared joy in the journey of growth, discovery, and success.